The British countryside was draped in a heavy, suffocating silence at 3 o'clock on the morning of the 8th of August, 1963. Along the West Coast Main Line, a mechanical titan known as the Royal Mail traveling post office surged through the darkness. It was carrying more than just letters and parcels from Glasgow to London. Hidden within its steel skin was a fortune in used banknotes that would soon ignite a national crisis. Driver Jack Mills sat in the cabin, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic dance of the tracks illuminated by the locomotive headlamps. He was a veteran of the rails, accustomed to the predictable patterns of the night shift. However, as the train approached a signal gantry near Sears Crossing, the green light suddenly flickered and died. A stark, crimson glow replaced it, commanding the massive engine to grind to a halt. This was the moment the calculated silence of the night was shattered by a meticulously planned ambush. Mills stepped out of the cab to investigate the unexpected signal, unaware that he was walking into a trap set by ghosts. As he looked up at the signal light, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness of the embankment. Before he could react, a heavy blow descended upon him, plunging his world into a haze. In the high-value package carriage, several postal workers were busy sorting through stacks of registered mail. They were oblivious to the fact that the locomotive had been detached from the rest of the train. A gang of 15 men, dressed in boiler suits and masks, worked with the chilling precision of a commando unit. They moved through the darkness with quiet efficiency, guided by the dim light of their handheld torches. The robbers had used a simple set of leather gloves and a battery to manipulate the railway signaling system. By covering the green lens and powering the red one, they had brought a 100-ton train to a standstill with terrifying ease. This was not a crime of opportunity, but a masterclass in technical sabotage. They had studied the mechanical heartbeat of the British rail system to find its most vulnerable artery. Once the engine and the first two carriages were isolated, the gang forced the dazed driver to move the train forward. They stopped exactly at Bridego Bridge, where a fleet of getaway vehicles waited in the shadows below. The logistics of the operation were flawless, reflecting a level of preparation rarely seen in the criminal underworld. Every second was accounted for as the men began to breach the treasure room. Inside the second carriage, the robbers found what they had been dreaming of for months. Stacks of canvas bags were piled high, containing millions of pounds in untraceable, used currency. The sheer volume of the wealth was staggering, even for professional thieves. They began a human chain, tossing 120 bags of cash from the train down to the waiting trucks on the road below. The heavy bags thudded into the back of a weather-beaten Austin Lodestar, each one filled with the lifeblood of the British economy. There was no shouting, no unnecessary gunfire, and no panic among the ranks of the thieves. They worked in a rhythmic, focused silence that amplified the tension of the scene. They knew that every minute spent at the bridge increased the risk of discovery by the authorities. Within 30 minutes, the most valuable train in the country had been stripped of its most precious cargo. The robbers vanished into the night, leaving behind a bleeding driver and a bewildered crew of postal workers. The total haul was calculated at over £2.6 million, an astronomical figure for the early 60s. It was a sum that would equate to over £50 million in today's economy. As the sun began to rise over the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, the news of the heist spread like wildfire. The Great Train Robbery had officially begun, and Scotland Yard was facing a criminal mastermind unlike any they had encountered before. This was a direct challenge to the prestige of the crown and the security of the nation. The Phantom Army had struck and disappeared, leaving the world in total shock. Bruce Reynolds was not a common street thug born of desperation and violence. He was a sophisticated antiques dealer with an expensive taste for fine suits, fast cars, and high society living. To the world, he was a businessman, but behind the polished exterior lay a brilliant criminal mind that craved a score large enough to retire forever. He wanted to execute a heist that would be remembered for centuries. The motive was simple but profound: the pursuit of ultimate freedom through absolute wealth. Reynolds was tired of the small, messy robberies that yielded little profit and high risk. He envisioned a surgical operation that would strike at the very heart of the British establishment. He needed a target that was both massive in scale and vulnerable to a well-coordinated technical assault by a dedicated team. The breakthrough came from a mysterious informant known only as the Ulsterman, who provided critical intelligence about the Royal Mail trains. He revealed that the high-value package carriage frequently carried millions of pounds in used banknotes headed for destruction in London. This money was untraceable and essentially forgotten by the system until it reached the furnace. It was the perfect target for a man like Bruce. To pull off such a feat, Reynolds realized he could not work alone with his usual associates. He needed to assemble a specialized firm of experts, each possessing a unique skill set required for the mission. He reached out to Douglas Gordon Goody, a man known for his icy composure and tactical brilliance. Together, they began to vet and recruit the finest specialists from the London criminal underworld. They needed a logistics expert, so they brought in Buster Edwards, a former boxer with a talent for planning complex movements. For the mechanical challenges, they recruited Charlie Wilson, a fierce enforcer who could maintain discipline among the ranks. The group also merged with another professional gang from South London to ensure they had enough manpower to handle the heavy lifting required at the bridge. Perhaps the most critical recruit was Roger Corddry, a man who understood the intricate electrical workings of the British railway signals. Without his technical knowledge, the train would never have stopped in the middle of nowhere. Corddry was a quiet man who treated the hijacking like a scientific experiment. He spent weeks studying the wiring of signal gantries to ensure their fake red light would function perfectly. Ronnie Biggs was added to the roster almost as an afterthought, primarily because he was a close friend of Reynolds who needed money. Biggs was not a master criminal at the time, but his loyalty and willingness to participate made him a valuable asset. He was tasked with helping to secure an old train driver who could move the locomotive if the primary driver refused to cooperate. The planning phase was conducted in the dimly lit corners of the Star Tavern in Belgravia. Amidst the clouds of tobacco smoke and the clinking of pint glasses, the gang pored over stolen railway timetables and maps of the Buckinghamshire countryside. They mapped out every inch of the track, looking for a location that was remote enough to avoid witnesses but accessible to heavy getaway trucks. Reynolds insisted on absolute discipline and secrecy during the months leading up to the heist. He purchased Leatherslade Farm, a secluded property located just 27 miles from the target site. This would serve as their secret barracks and a warehouse for the stolen loot. The farm was chosen for its isolation, surrounded by rolling hills that provided a natural screen from any prying eyes of the local police. Every detail was rehearsed with military precision, from the timing of the signal tampering to the loading of the canvas bags. The gang practiced moving heavy weights in the dark to build the physical stamina required for the 3-minute window they had planned. Reynolds knew that the success of the mission depended on the speed of the execution and the total silence of the team. The funding for the operation came from a series of smaller, less ambitious thefts carried out by the members over the previous year. They invested thousands of pounds into buying Land Rovers, trucks, and specialized equipment like military-grade radio scanners. This was an expensive venture, a criminal startup that required significant capital before the first pound of the big score could ever be touched. As the date approached, the tension within the firm reached a breaking point. They were about to commit the largest robbery in the history of the United Kingdom against an institution protected by the Crown. Reynolds looked at his men and saw a group of professionals ready to transcend their petty criminal origins. They were no longer just thieves. They were the architects of a legendary transformation. The clock struck 3 in the morning as the gang took their final positions along the desolate stretch of track near Ledburn. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the electric hum of the railway infrastructure. Bruce Reynolds checked his watch, his heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm of a man who had calculated every possible variable. There was no room for error in the darkness of Buckinghamshire. Roger Corddry moved toward the signal gantry with the silent grace of a shadow. He carried a set of heavy leather gloves and a standard 6-volt battery, tools that seemed far too simple for a crime of this magnitude. He carefully climbed the metal ladder, his breath hitching as a distant whistle signaled the approach of the target. The high-value package train was exactly on schedule for its doom. With the precision of a surgeon, Corddry attached the battery wires to the signal mechanism. He covered the green lamp with his glove, effectively blinding the locomotive and forcing the system to display a false red light. This was the genius of the plan. They were not fighting the system, but rather whispering a lie into its mechanical ear. The massive train would have no choice but to obey the command. As the locomotive rounded the bend, the screech of metal brakes echoed through the valley like a dying beast. Jack Mills brought the massive engine to a halt, peering through the glass at the unexpected crimson glow. He stepped down into the gravel, his boots crunching loudly in the silence of the night. He was looking for a reason, but all he found was a masked figure. The assault was swift and brutal, designed to overwhelm the crew before they could trigger any alarms. A heavy iron bar swung through the air, connecting with the back of the driver head. Mills collapsed onto the tracks, his consciousness slipping away as the gang surged forward. They had no interest in causing death, but they would not allow any man to stand in their way. 2 members of the gang, experts in heavy machinery, quickly worked to decouple the locomotive and the first 2 carriages from the rest of the train. The remaining 10 carriages, filled with unsuspecting postal workers, were left behind in the darkness. This was the surgical strike that Reynolds had envisioned, isolating the treasure from its protectors in a matter of mere seconds. The gang forced the dazed second man in the cab to move the engine forward toward Bradego Bridge. This specific location had been chosen because the track height perfectly matched the roof of their waiting trucks. It was a masterpiece of topographical planning that allowed for the fastest possible transfer of the heavy loot. Every foot of movement was a step closer to their ultimate financial freedom. When the train stopped at the bridge, the robbers used crowbars to shatter the windows of the high-value package carriage. Inside, 77 postal workers were startled by the sudden intrusion of masked men wielding clubs. The workers had been told that their carriage was a rolling fortress, but they watched in terror as the thin walls were breached by the determined firm. Reynolds stood on the tracks, directing his men with the quiet authority of a general on a battlefield. He watched as the first canvas bags were pulled from the shelves and tossed through the broken doors. Each bag was heavy with the weight of hundreds of 20-pound notes, representing the life savings of 1,000 citizens. The sheer volume of the cash was overwhelming. A human chain was formed from the carriage door down to the road below, where the Austin Lodestar waited. The men worked in a rhythmic, desperate silence, their muscles straining under the weight of the massive haul. There were 120 bags in total, each one a piece of a puzzle that would complete their lives. They had exactly 30 minutes to finish. The Austin Lodestar and 2 Land Rovers were soon sagging under the immense weight of the stolen currency. The tires pressed deep into the soft mud of the embankment as the final bags were secured under the canvas covers. Reynolds gave the signal to withdraw, knowing that the police would soon be alerted by the workers left behind on the tracks. The escape had begun. They drove away from the bridge in a tight convoy, their headlights cutting through the early morning mist. There was a sense of wild, electric triumph in the air as they realized they had actually done it. They had challenged the most powerful railway system in the world and walked away with its greatest prize. The Great Train Robbery was no longer a plan. It was a reality. The convoy of vehicles roared through the narrow country lanes, the suspension of the trucks groaning under the weight of the massive haul. They arrived at Leatherslade Farm, a secluded hideout that Bruce Reynolds had meticulously chosen for its isolation from the world. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, the men felt a surge of pure adrenaline, believing they had truly outsmarted the entire British establishment. Inside the farmhouse, the scene was one of chaotic celebration and overwhelming wealth. The 120 canvas bags were piled high in the living room, their contents spilling out across the floor in a sea of green and red banknotes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the sweat of men who had just committed the heist of the century. Reynolds maintained a strict command, ordering his men to keep the noise down and stay away from the windows. They spent the first few hours feverishly counting the loot, realizing that the final total was even larger than their wildest dreams. Each man was looking at a share that would provide a lifetime of luxury in any corner of the globe they chose to hide. To pass the time and settle their frayed nerves, the gang engaged in a moment of surreal arrogance that would later become legendary. They sat around a kitchen table and played a game of Monopoly, using the actual stolen banknotes instead of the play money provided in the box. This casual display of power showed just how untouchable they felt in their secluded fortress deep within the countryside. However, the atmosphere of triumph began to sour as news of the police response reached them via a transistor radio. Scotland Yard had launched a massive manhunt, and the flying squad was already scouring the region for any sign of the getaway vehicles. The gang realized that the isolation of the farm, once their greatest asset, was now becoming a potential trap if they stayed too long. The original plan was to remain at Leatherslade Farm for several weeks until the initial heat of the investigation had died down. But the sheer scale of the police operation forced Reynolds to change his strategy on the fly. He decided that the firm must split up and vanish into the anonymity of London as quickly as possible, leaving the quiet farmhouse behind forever. Before departing, Reynolds gave a specific and crucial order to a local associate who had been hired to assist with the logistics. He instructed the man to thoroughly clean the entire farm and then burn the building to the ground to destroy all forensic evidence. He believed that fire would be the final seal on their perfect crime, erasing every fingerprint and hair they left. The gang departed in separate cars, carrying their individual shares of the millions in small, manageable suitcases. They blended into the morning traffic, disappearing into the urban labyrinth of the city like ghosts returning to the mist. For a few days, it seemed as though the mastermind had accounted for every detail and that the trail had gone cold for the frustrated investigators. But the perfect crime was about to be undone by a single, catastrophic failure of human nature. The man hired to torch the farm had become paralyzed by fear, or perhaps a sudden attack of conscience. Instead of setting the blaze that would have saved the gang, he simply abandoned the property and fled, leaving the farmhouse exactly as it was when the robbers left. A suspicious neighbor, noticing the unusual activity and the strange vehicles at the abandoned farm, eventually contacted the local police. When the officers arrived at Leatherslade, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence that would break the case wide open. The gang had been careless in their haste, leaving behind piles of dirty dishes, empty food tins, and the infamous Monopoly board. Scotland Yard forensic experts descended on the site with a level of intensity that the criminals had never anticipated. They found fingerprints on a bottle of tomato ketchup and a tin of salt, matching them to known criminals in their database. The most damning evidence was found on the Monopoly board itself, where the robbers had left clear prints while playing their arrogant game. The transition from successful masterminds to hunted fugitives happened in the blink of an eye. The police now had names and faces to match the shadows at Brightigo Bridge, and the dragnet began to tighten around the members of the firm. The arrogance of the game had provided the very tools that the law needed to dismantle the greatest criminal organization in British history. The fingerprints on the Monopoly board became the ultimate betrayal of the gang by their own hubris. Scotland Yard investigators moved with lightning speed, matching the marks to a database of known career criminals from the London underworld. Within days, the names of the 15 men were broadcast across every television screen and newspaper in the United Kingdom. The hunters had finally found the scent of their prey in the countryside. One by one, the members of the firm were cornered in cramped apartments and busy city streets. Roger Corddry was the first to fall, caught with a significant portion of his share while trying to rent a garage. The legendary unity of the group began to crumble under the immense pressure of the national dragnet. Most of the men were captured within a few months of the bridge ambush near the isolated farm. The trial at Aylesbury in early 1964 became a theatrical spectacle that captivated the entire world. The prosecution painted a picture of a paramilitary organization that had dared to strike at the heart of the British monarchy. While the public was fascinated by the audacity of the heist, the legal system was determined to send a message of absolute zero tolerance for such defiance. This was a war for the social order. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies delivered a series of crushing blows when he handed down the final sentences. 7 of the primary conspirators were given 30 years in prison, a duration that was virtually unheard of for non-violent crimes. The harshness of the punishment stunned the courtroom and divided public opinion. Many felt the state was seeking revenge for being humiliated by a group of working-class thieves and their plan. However, the story of the Great Train Robbery was far from over after the heavy iron gates of the prisons closed. In July 1965, Ronnie Biggs scaled the wall of Wandsworth Prison using a rope ladder and a waiting moving van. He vanished into the labyrinth of the London docks, beginning a journey that would take him through Paris and eventually to the sunny beaches of Brazil. His escape was another embarrassment, Biggs lived as a fugitive in Rio de Janeiro for 36 years, becoming a global icon of the outlaw lifestyle. He underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance and fathered a child to avoid extradition back to the United Kingdom. His presence in Brazil became a constant source of frustration for the British authorities, who watched helplessly as he recorded songs with famous punk rock bands and entertained the media. Bruce Reynolds, the architect of the entire operation, managed to evade capture for 5 long years by hiding in Mexico and Canada. He eventually returned to England and was arrested in the quiet seaside town of Torquay in 1968. By the time he was caught, most of his millions had been spent on living expenses and legal fees for his associates. The mastermind had finally run out of time and luck. Amidst the tales of daring escapes and foreign hideouts, the tragic human cost of the robbery was often overlooked by the media. Jack Mills, the driver who had been struck with the iron bar, never fully recovered from his severe head injuries. He suffered from constant headaches and a profound loss of confidence for the rest of his life. His health slowly declined until his death in 1970, a forgotten victim. The vast majority of the £2.6 million was never recovered by the police or the Royal Mail. It is believed that the money was laundered through a series of complex front companies or buried in forgotten locations across the country. The lost fortune remains a tantalizing mystery for treasure hunters and historians alike. The thieves had won the financial war, even if they lost their freedom and their reputations. The legacy of the robbery forced a total overhaul of the security measures used by the British railway and postal systems. New armored carriages were designed with reinforced walls and advanced alarm systems that were much harder to breach from the outside. The vulnerability that Bruce Reynolds had exploited was permanently sealed, ensuring that such a massive heist could never be repeated with the same level of ease in the future. Today, the Great Train Robbery stands as a pivotal moment in 20th century criminal history, blurring the lines between reality and fiction. It has inspired countless books and movies that continue to romanticize the calculated brilliance of the firm at Bradego Bridge. While the robbers were eventually brought to justice, their legend remains etched into the cultural identity of Britain as the ultimate act of criminal defiance and ambition. The story of the 15 men and their human chain of cash bags serves as a stark reminder of the power of preparation. It also highlights the inevitable downfall that comes from a single moment of careless arrogance in the face of the law. The tracks near Ledburn are quiet now, but the echoes of that frantic night in August will continue to resonate for many generations of analysts to come.